Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to CEFS and also welcome to those who join our conference online. My name is Nadzia Laurentseva. I'm a research fellow here at the Economic Policy Unit, and today I'm very happy to host this policy dialogue, which is jointly co-organized by two projects, the MEDAM, which is Mercator Dialogue on Asylum and Migration, and the Darendorf Forum. Both projects are funded by the Mercator Foundation, and we gratefully acknowledge also the support of the foundation in organizing this event. So today we will talk about public and political perceptions to migration. It is usually claimed that political actions on immigration and asylum, either on the national level or on the EU level, are motivated by prevailing public opinion. Today, during the meeting, we will actually critically review this statement, and we try to understand better how public opinion interacts with the political perceptions. I'm very happy to introduce our speakers. So the first is Josephine Graf. She's coming from Berlin. She's based currently at the Hertie School of Governance, and she's the member of the Darendorf Forum. Josephine's research, among others, focuses on the role of political communication, and today she will be actually the final speaker among researchers, and she will discuss the role of policymakers' narratives on migration and how they can shape public opinion and perceptions of migration. Then I have Esther Ademer and Tobias Stör. Esther and Tobias are based at the Kiel Institute for World Economy, and they're part of the MEDAM project. So basically, they are our colleagues from MEDAM. Esther and Tobias' research focuses on perceptions of the public to migration and asylum, and they actually use very innovative analysis using big data from social media and also from existing surveys. And in their research, they try to combine approaches of political science and economics. Then I have Lenka Dražanova. Lenka Dražanova came here from Florence. She is based at the European University Institute, and she is the member of the OPAM, which is the Observatory on Public Attitudes to Migration. Lenka's research, again among others, focuses on understanding the development of populism and nationalism in current times, and also in understanding its underlying causes. And last and not least, I'm very honored to introduce our policy discussant for today. This is Ms. Monica de Koning. Ms. de Koning is currently the member of the Belgian Parliament, and from 2011 until 2014, she was the Minister of Labour in Belgium. And prior to this, she was the chairwoman of the CPS in Antwerp, which she headed since 2000 until 2011. Ms. Koning's expertise actually lies in the areas of asylum and migration, poverty reduction, integration to the labor market, and gender rights, and therefore we are very much looking forward to your policy comment on our presentations. So now just to set the schedule, we will start with 3 research inputs from the researchers of about 10 minutes each. Then we will have the comment of Ms. de Koning, and then we will open the discussion to your questions. If you have any clarification questions to the presenters, please feel free to ask. Otherwise, if the questions are more philosophical and deeper, we will keep it until the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nadzia. As Nadzia rightly said, my name is Esther Ademer, and I'm very happy to be here today and present joint work with Tobias Stör on public attitudes and the so-called refugee crisis. We set out doing that research by taking issue with a perceived negativity in public opinion towards immigration. We were wondering whether there was indeed a shift of public opinion of a majority that was getting more anti-immigration, or whether we are actually seeing a relatively loud minority that is dominating the debate and thus generating this perceived negativity in tone. What we do in our research is to basically look at micro-level evidence, and I brought some of that with me today for you, drawing on data from the European Social Survey and on data that we actually collected ourselves from a bigger research project where we'll deal with Facebook comments that are made below newspaper articles on the issue of asylum and migration. So let us start with the evidence from the European Social Survey, and you'll find more details on that in a policy brief that should be distributed somehow in the end of the room. We were looking into the over time development of how people reply to some of the survey questions that the European Social Survey regularly asks people in Europe since 2002. And we are looking at three broader questions that capture immigration attitudes of the wider public in a very broad level, on a very broad basis. So what you can see here is basically the overtime development of three items in that survey, and that is, the first item is whether a country's cultural life is undermined or enriched by migrants. So this is the question that is being asked to people, whether immigrants make a country a worse or better place to live, and whether immigration is perceived to be actually good or bad for a country's economy. Note that people, when being asked about these questions, are supposed to give their opinion on these issues on a 0 to 10 scale. That means, for instance, if I consider that immigrants make a country a much worse place to live, then I would pick a 0. If I think that immigrants make a country a much better place to live, I would probably pick the 10. If I'm undecided what immigration actually does to the country, then I would probably pick a 5. So somehow locate myself on a more neutral middle ground in between these two more extreme poles. And what you can see here now is how those 13 EU member states that have been polled on these questions since 2002 have developed over time. And if we take the average of all these member states, the first thing that we see, and that we found quite striking, is that there is overly not a large change in attitudes towards immigration. If you look into this weighted average here, you see that there has been a slight increase in attitudes. So people selecting more positive views when being asked about their migration preferences than in 2002, which is the first data point here. The second finding that we found quite interesting is that the range of public opinion that we see in these 13 EU member states is not varying that much. So I just described the scale a little bit. If you look into what the majority of these countries actually answers to these questions, we see that most of them are located somehow between a 4 and a 6. So they are really slightly deviating from this neutral middle ground of not being really decided what immigration actually does to a country. We do see that there is some variation in some countries, which is probably not surprising. We see that there is a strong tendency in Hungary in the last years to actually display more negative views towards migration or immigration. And we see that there are tendencies, for instance, in Portugal, where this is improving. But what we would like you to take from this is that those are rather outlier countries and not representative of a general trend, which often is portrayed as such in the public debate. You may now argue that this result may well be driven not by the fact that people are simply agnostic about immigration, but that we actually see a stronger polarization within societies, so that there are fierce opponents against immigration that are basically leveling out fierce proponents of immigration, that on average we see this very neutral result. So what we did next is to look exactly at that. And we do so, we present the results here for two countries, namely Germany and Hungary. And what you can see here is that the large majority of people within these countries is still pretty neutral about immigration and what they think about it. So here you can see that in Germany, for instance, almost 37% say that, well, they locate themselves on the middle ground, not really knowing. Here the question is whether immigration makes the country a worse or better place to live. So they are rather neutral on that question. What we see over time, though, and this is in line with this polarization hypothesis, is that this bar here in the middle gets smaller. So those people that are actually more agnostic about immigration get fewer in number. And we see that for the case of Germany, these people seemingly shift to a slight extent more to the more positive level. So they are rather answering in a more, they are answering in a way that they would deem immigration to have a more positive impact. In Hungary, we see that it is the opposite way around. If you look into how, for instance, this bar here increases over time, you can see that in 2016, 2017, almost 13% of Hungarians say that immigration makes their country a much worse place to live, period. So they are really selecting the most extreme value on that scale. So this is the first findings that we have from the European Social Survey data, where we find some evidence for increasing polarization, but we also find that on average, attitudes towards migration have not gotten worse; they've rather gotten slightly better. Okay, let's now look into social media as promised. What we were doing is we were actually trying to filter out comments that people left underneath newspaper articles that are dealing with the issue of migration and asylum in Germany. We looked into newspaper articles that were posted by local and regional newspapers. That is a kind of newspaper that is very widespread in Germany, and we looked into 81 of them across the entire country. And we were retrieving all the comments that people left underneath these newspaper articles. We analyzed them with a variety of methods. We had a manually coded way of approaching the comments that were left there, and we also worked with different quantitative methods, including topic modeling. We can talk about that in the Q&A if you're interested. Some of the results that we find is, first of all, that the amount of people who are commenting on social media underneath these articles on migration and asylum drastically increases. If you translate the findings of this figure into an offline context, you can think about a room in 2012 here, where there would be around 5 people that would meet to discuss a newspaper article on migration and asylum in 2012. If you went into that room in January 2016, there would be 25 people. So this is 5 times the size of people discussing these issues on social media in a relatively short period of time. So there's a drastic increase in comment activity here, identified by the unique users who are commenting. And we see that this increase is not driven by platform increase. These are the Facebook users that are commenting over time, and the platform growth precedes the growth in comment activity quite substantially. We asked a specific research question now to make sense of the data and look a little bit into what we can find there. And the research question that we asked for this research output is whether social media users in Germany actually increasingly politicize the EU when talking about issues of migration and asylum. The hypothesis would be that they do so. Because they are more aware of interdependencies, they are more aware of, for instance, the effectiveness of the Schengen or the Dublin system. So one of the hope that many people had during the refugee crisis is that this would actually help to democratize the EU a bit, because people would talk more about the EU. So this is the hypothesis that we tried to investigate in that type of research. And what we did, first of all, is to look into the average share of comments in our data set that are mentioning the EU or Europe to some extent. And this figure shows you that the average share of these comments remains pretty constant over time. It is not substantially increasing. It is around 2% of all comments somehow mention the EU or Europe in its vaguest terms. This is not a large share of comments, and it is not increasing in size. So this would go a little bit against this hypothesis that people actually start to politicize the EU more over time. We see that the trend in comment activity is rather driven by news on national politics, or by newspaper articles that deal with national politics. You can see that there's a general time trend that is, of course, in line with the comment activity that we have seen increasing, and we see that this trend is driven especially by the national level that we capture here. When people talk about European politics, so the very few people that do so, they mostly talk about other member states. So they mention Hungary, for instance, or they mention France, but they do not necessarily, or very, like in 20% of all cases, talk really about the EU, its policies, or its institutions. So what do we make out of these inputs now? So we have seen that attitudes are, on average, rather more positive than more negative than 16 years ago, and that there is relatively little variation across countries. So the spectrum in which the countries in the EU actually diverge on these attitudes is not that large. We have also seen that there is a drastic increase in social media activity on these themes. And that Europe within these debates has not been increasingly politicized, but it is rather national politics that dominate the debate. And we say that tying these insights together, that may contribute to our understanding also why we see or why we perceive this change in views. So there is apparently a large crowd of people commenting, for instance, on social media, but this is not necessarily reflective of a general population that holds not necessarily more negative views towards immigration per se. And I'll leave it here, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Esther, for this insightful talk. Now we will have Lenka Dražanova from the EUI, again providing us with some more evidence about public perceptions to migration and also public perceptions about the role of EU.
So thank you, Nadia, for this introduction. I apologize, I'm losing my voice a little bit, so hopefully I will make it through. I think my presentation builds quite nicely on what Esther has already presented, but I would like to concentrate a little bit on the differences between European countries regarding public attitudes to immigration, and also what that might mean for the European elections in 2019. So there are a few key messages, I would like to highlight already at the beginning of the presentation, and I will elaborate further on them later on. So, and this has been already said in the previous presentation, we know that public attitudes to immigration in Europe are actually becoming more positive over the years. Europeans are in general also very much in favor of a common European migration policy. However, and we will see this later, there are quite big differences between countries. Many of you might ask, how is it possible that we perceive a so-called rise of anti-immigration attitudes? And what I would like to show you later on in this presentation is that what makes a difference is actually the salience of the issue of immigration. And I will elaborate on that a little bit further. So the good news is that Europe is actually much more united regarding public attitudes to immigration than ever before. But the bad news is that those that are anti-immigrant are much more mobilized than they used to be in the past. I would just like to briefly mention that all the data I will be using today are readily available on the website of the Observatory of Public Attitudes to Migration, where I work. We are very pleased with the new database we collected, which actually shows attitudes to immigration in countries in Europe and beyond since 1981. We talk a lot about attitudes to immigration, but what should be emphasized is that what do we mean by that? Because attitudes to immigration can mean many different things. So, for example, they can be attitudes towards a specific policy. For example, should immigrants have access to the welfare system of a specific country? And if so, after how long they have been living in that specific country. They can also mean an evaluation of a specific group. So, for example, what do Germans think about Turkish immigrants, or what do Czechs think about Ukrainian immigrants? It can be also opinions about immigrants per se. Are immigrants bad or good? Are they criminals? And so on and so forth. They can also mean attitudes towards the perceived effects of immigration. So, for example, example, does immigration contribute to the higher or lower GDP per capita? What effect does immigration have on the national culture, on the crime rate, and so on and so forth? So we should always keep in mind that there is a broad range of attitudes towards immigration, and we don't talk about just one type of attitude. So why do people differ in their attitudes between themselves and sometimes also within time, within one person within time? So we know from social science research that people actually, and this should be very much emphasized, rarely change their attitudes after a certain age. It can happen, but it's very rare. So you form your attitudes already at the beginning of your life. For example, what can influence your attitudes is your personality type, your general moral values, and so on and so forth. Of course, also early life socialization, such as your parents' views, your peer views, the type of school you went to, and so on and so forth. So if you look at this chart, you can think about this as somehow how you go through life. So on the left-hand side, you have effects that are very stable and very strong. As I just mentioned, your personality type, your general values, and so on and so forth. As we move through life, and we become adults, then there might be some media effects or party cues and so on and so forth, but these effects are very unstable and very weak. So here is, I wanted to show you, but Esther already talked about this. We can see that, for example, even after the migration crisis, attitudes towards immigrants from outside the EU became actually more positive. In this map, you see higher, darker colors actually mean more positive attitudes towards immigrants. So you can see that for many countries, even after the migration crisis, attitudes actually became more positive. This is also valid for attitudes for immigrants within the EU. So this is an attitude towards intra-European immigration. So how can we explain the perceived rise of anti-immigration attitudes? And we can say this is more about salience. So as you can see here, salience has risen sharply since the migration crisis. And what is interesting, that people perceive that immigration is an issue for Europe, affecting Europe much more than their own country, and much more than them personally. But what I just presented before were numbers for the overall European population, but we should keep in mind there is a big difference between countries. So, for example, and between themselves, and also whether countries perceive immigration as an issue for their own country or for Europe. What is interesting is that from this map you can see that countries that generally have very low immigration rates, such as Central European countries, perceive immigration as an issue, more of an European issue than a country issue. And this has changed dramatically also within the years with the migration crisis. So before the migration crisis, Central European countries did not perceive immigration as an European issue that much as they do now. Here is the good news for now, is that Europeans overall are also much in favor of a common European migration policy, and this has not changed over the years. But again, this is a chart for the entire European population, and less good news is that if we look at the country differences, we see a sharp difference between countries. So when you have countries such as Spain or Germany, which are very much in favor of a common European migration policy, we see that, for example, Czech Republic or Estonia, and usually countries from the Central Eastern Europe, are in general against it. And this has, however, changed over time. At the beginning of the migration crisis, the Central European countries were kind of at the same level as the Western European countries, but with the migration crisis, we can see that, for example, this chart shows the Visegrad Group countries. The favorability for the common European migration policy has sharply changed. Why do countries differ, actually, in their attitudes to immigration in general? Usually it's about how immigrants are perceived in that country. So if in that society countries are, immigrants are perceived as rather common, then rather something different, or something untraditional, if they are perceived as unthreatening rather than threatening to norms, values, or the security, and if they are perceived as people equal in status and power rather than viewed as subordinate, then in these countries usually migrants are viewed much more positively. So if you remember the figure I showed at the beginning, why do individuals differ in their attitudes? We can apply something very similar also to countries. Why do they differ in their attitudes? So for example, you can see there are strong and stable effects at the country level. These are, for example, the general culture, but also history, geography, and so on and so forth. And as we move past, we see that, for example, party cues or media effects are actually very weak. So not only individuals rarely change their once established views regarding immigrants, but also countries moved quite slowly, changing the public opinions. So I'm coming back to where I started. The key messages from this presentation are that Europeans overall are actually becoming much more positive towards immigration and immigrants, as they are in favor of the common European migration policy. But we should keep in mind that those that have been anti-immigration already from the beginning, with the rising salience of the issue of immigration, became much more mobilized. So, and this is important for their voting. So for example, people that have been anti-immigrant already from the beginning, they used to vote according to other issues. They, for example, chose parties that were more economically conservative. They chose to vote according to different issues. Now that immigration is a very salient issue, they vote much more according to this cue. So this is all for me for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lenka. And now we will have the third researcher actually presenting a slightly different perspective, but I think her presentation nicely follows up from what Lenka alluded to. So what drives differences, for instance, between countries, and what role do, for example, policy narratives play in these attitudes? So I'm happy to introduce Josephine Graf from Heritage School of Governance and her presentation.
Thanks for the introduction. Indeed, my presentation kind of picks up on a few points that were just mentioned, in particular as regards polarization, right? And how we can respond to that, how we can respond to national differences, which of course, as we all know, make a difference with regards to political stability, right? And the voting results we've seen on all of these things. So this talk is part of a bigger project in which I look at the notion of narratives, of migration specifically, irregular refugee migration, and how that features in policy making and policy advisory work. There we go. Yeah. So as this slide indicates, we're not only talking a lot about migration, we're also talking a lot about narratives of migration, stories of migration. And in particular, we talk about what narratives are problematic for the future of the European integration process, for social cohesion in the European Union, for the values that the EU promotes, etc. So there are quite a few projects going on at the moment looking at these things. But what I've found in my research so far, and again, that's part of a bigger project, policy work related to narratives of migration in particular is not as effective as it could be, especially when it comes to responding to populist narratives of migration, which I'm going to talk about today. Populist narratives of migration, just broadly speaking, I'll come back to that, is characterized by an oversimplification of social and political complexity on a narrative level in particular. and as we're probably all aware of, an overemphasis on the us and them distinction, okay? So us, the Europeans, the Germans, the French, whatever, and then the migrants, in particular the refugees, asylum seekers on the other side. And today I want to talk about how we might render our counter-narratives to those stories more effective. Now, to begin with, it's not exactly a surprise, perhaps, or not coincidence that we're mostly talking about narrative and not stories, okay? So narrative is much more prevalent as a term. Even, of course, the two are quite often also used synonymously. In the policy world, particular narrative has become a placeholder, if you like, for all sorts of aspects of political communication, okay? Those are the alternatives that you also see quite a lot in the literature and also in public policy discourse. We talk about frames and metaphors and messages and all of that. And it's kind of become, you know, kind of a big bundle of terms to talk about how we communicate, for example, about migration. But, and I think that's what I want to point out, all of these things are different, relate to different elements of political communication, different aspects of sense-making, okay, that we're using in everyday discourses. And narrative is useful as a term, of course, but it's usually or should be used as a shortcut for stories, okay? Of course, we cannot always, like, you know, talk about stories as complex as they are whenever we want to talk about migration, for example. But we should only use it if we're actually referring to storytelling, okay, and not metaphors or frames. Just to give you a short definition of what a story is specifically, it gives meaning, that's the first important part, the meaning of our social reality by connecting heterogeneous events within time and space and via each other, okay? And that is very specific, or that is very specific to storytelling. Now, to give you an example, so one of the stories that is quite prevalent in current political discourse is this one, okay? So there was a massive influx of irregular immigrants into the European Union in 2015, and we were not prepared then, but since then we've taken quite a lot of measures, both on the national and the EU level, and the numbers are going down, so there is no need to panic, okay? You see how the different events are connected in time and space and how they relate to each other. The narrative shortcut for that might be the refugee crisis is over, okay? So, and we see that quite a bit these days, especially with regards to the official numbers going down. That is different from talking about frames, for example. So you could be talking about migration and security issue, which of course has implications for how you address it. You could then, related to that frame, talk about migration as a wave, yeah, which of course gets it closer to migration being a natural catastrophe. So all of these are, of course, related in many ways, but they address different elements, different levels of political communication. Stories are not actually that difficult to identify because they have a few key elements, a few of which I want to address. So the first thing is they have a basic structure, okay? So they start somewhere, they have a beginning, they go somewhere, the middle, and they end somewhere. The middle, of course, can be very different, can be stretched out or shortened, it can be there can be fewer or more turning points, right? So there's quite a bit of room to play here, but that's the basic structure of a story. The second thing is that we're always looking at the conclusion, okay? So a story is defined by its conclusion. We're trying to follow the story, okay? That's a predisposition, psychological one, towards following stories. That's why they also work so well and keep us interested if they're good stories. So once we've arrived at the conclusion, in hindsight, we have to be able to say, yes, those events led up to that conclusion. That's plausible. That makes sense, okay? The third point, they're necessarily selective, okay? No storytelling is ever neutral in any way. We always have to select events and we have to choose how to connect them to each other. That's very important for the moral dimension of storytelling, okay? So our storytelling, whoever we are, is shaped by identities and by our ideologies, by our values, norms, etc. The things that Lenka just mentioned. And finally, good storytelling tends to be emotive, yeah, have an emotional appeal to people, and very importantly, relate to people's life worlds, okay? So they need to be able, yeah, to relate to what you're talking about and to their own experiences in order to resonate with them. Now, why are populist stories potentially problematic? So very generally speaking, populist communication seeks to divide people, the elite, those in power, from the people, as two supposedly homogeneous groups. That's the very broad definition of populism on the most basic level. And populists, importantly, seek to distance themselves from the other elites, they usually are, by all standards, and pretend that they know the people better, okay, without even having to find out about their opinions. They just know them better because they identify with the people, which ultimately usually leads to the phenomenon that populist actors pretend that they're the only, or claim that they're the only real representatives, which of course is an issue for representative democracies and the idea of changing majorities in those systems. Now, in policy circles, populist stories of migration are usually considered to be problematic because they distort migration realities, they radicalize people, they polarize societies, they emotionalize stories about migration, etc. Okay? But, and that's very important, popular storytelling is not necessarily better than non-popular storytelling, or at least less popular storytelling. There's a certain degree, or continuum of populism, if you like. So, for example, they tend to be better at emotionally appealing to people, but what they have quite often is a not very well developed middle. Okay, so there are a lot of plot in the whole. A lot of holes in the plot of their stories. Okay, so there are different elements, but just to say, there's nothing that would make them automatically, those stories automatically better and more appealing than other kinds of storytelling. So why do we still find it so difficult then to tell stories that not only talk about inclusion, diversity, but that are also inclusive themselves? And my argument is that we focus too much on questions of ideology, of the grand narratives of European values, and not enough on the actual practices of storytelling. 3 short examples. Yes, I have 1 minute. I'm going to rush through this. First of all, we tend to ascribe a lot of stories to populism that they don't actually tell, okay? And that's where our own political ideology tends to come in. So, for example, the shortcut narrative that only natives and not aliens deserve social benefits, okay? That's one of the things that counter stories try to respond to, but in actual fact, it's not the story that is told by populist actors most likely, right? What they focus instead on is social legal norms, okay, or social legal level of community relationships to kind of say, yes, aliens don't deserve the social benefits that natives do because they've paid into the system, okay? And the new arrivals haven't, which is different from the grand narrative that we see, which is usually focused on human rights, okay? That social benefits are given to asylum seekers naturally because it is part of leading a dignified life, okay? And looking at those different levels, human right and social legal rights, that is, for example, one of the things where populist stories and counter stories kind of diverge, and we need to also then address the level of social legal rights and not human rights, because otherwise we're talking past each other. The second example, just very quickly, when we talk about inclusion, diversity, what that kind of storytelling quite often does is to try to erase this basic protagonist-antagonist structure in stories. But that is something that works with people, generally speaking. There's a reason why crime stories are so successful, because they follow that very basic principle, okay? So the tension, for example, between migration and democracy, and the tension between us and them, that needs to be dealt with productively and not try to erase it. And finally, the last point, we have to look at the conclusion. Just saying the crisis, for example, is over because numbers are going down doesn't resonate with a lot of people because it can't be the final conclusion. Okay, of course, there are other migration dynamics going on globally. We know that. The average population knows that. So we can't stop there, okay? We have to think through to the end of the conclusion and communicate that as well, okay? What can people expect in the next 10, 20, 30 years? Just 3 examples, there are more, but that's the kind of things that we need to look at more. Just 2 points to conclude. There's a lot of work to do for us, right? If we can influence those kind of political stories to change attitudes, then we need to do that. And finally, don't look so much on ideologies, values. We do that already a lot. What we need to look at more is the actual practices of storytelling.
Thank you very much, Josephine. So right now we have heard the perspective of researchers, and now Ms. Monica de Koning kindly agreed to share the perspective of a policymaker, and in particular how you as a policymaker take into account public perceptions and vice versa, how public perceptions influence your work, and can your work influence public perceptions?
Okay. Hello, thank you for the invitation. I have 10 minutes to explain the world. Yeah, so that's quite difficult. I will excuse myself on forehand because I am not used to speak English, and I see that the young generation is much more fluent than me, but I will try to do my best. A third thing, I will say or explain things too much black and white, although I'm personal in favor of 50 Shades of Grey, also in politics. Yeah. But I will use it because I have only 10 minutes. If I look to the attitudes in Belgium towards migration, I think it's 50-50. 50 are tolerant, 50% are intolerant. And that's the result of the latest research. But I say Belgium, and Belgium is not big, but there is a big difference between the big cities and the rest of Belgium. I have been for 11 years vice mayor in Antwerp. And in the 1990s, we had the very popular right-wing, extreme right-wing parties. And that was a reaction on migration from the Turkey and the North African countries towards our big cities. And so we have started on local level with integration actions, with narratives, new narratives, and so on. And it has taken almost 10 years before people have said, okay, it's a fact. Migrants are in our city. We should manage it well. And maybe in the future, it will have positive effects. Yeah. But of course, with the migration crisis recently, 2015, now migration is spread all over the country. And so in the little cities, in the villages, now for the first time, there has been a confrontation with migrants. And of course, that's a shock for people. Because I hear from you a lot of figures and rationality, but you have to look to emotional reactions. All kinds of changes in society, that's difficult for a lot of people. They are always asking, was in it for me? Or what will I lose? What will be changed? And if you are a well-educated person with a lot of flexibility and possibilities, it's easier to accept changes. If you are not well-educated, if you have a not so well economic or social economic position. It's hard. It's concurrency. It's you are afraid of it. Yeah. And in Flanders, the Flemish part, but I also think in the French part, one thing in Belgium is very important. If you work and you keep your children or you educate your children well, and you clean your house well and your street, and you are kind to people, it's okay. The big problem, if you speak about narratives, is that migration here is mixed up asylum seekers, fugitives, and economic migration. And of course, we have also European institutions, regular migration. They all mix it up in politics, and especially popular political parties are making one soup of it in the sense. So you have a black and white communication about migration, and that's quite bad for public opinion. So what I'm saying is that time, the element time is a very important element in migration and integration. We think that everyone who is arriving here within 5 years can be integrated. It's not like that. I don't know if you know Emmanuel Todt. He's a French researcher. And he says that technological evolution goes quite quick, 5 to 10 years. But evolution in values, in attitudes, takes 50 years. Why is that? I will try to explain it in a very short way. You are educated by your parents. And often you say, when you have discussions with your parents when you are young, you say, when I will have children, I will do it in a different way. And then a few years later, when you have children, you are hearing yourself saying the same sentences as your father and your mother. Yeah? So the first 10 years of your life are very important in adapting and accepting values. It's not very conscious, but it's in you. And when you give your education to your children, you are saying almost the same things. So changing values is very, very difficult. On the other hand, I have been for 11 years vice mayor for social affairs in Antwerp. And what I have discovered is that almost all the people are dreaming about the same things. A good job, a good house, a good partner. And sometimes I'm saying, but everyone is always laughing, for the women, good babies, and for the men, a good car. But maybe now I should say good mobility, because cars, it's not so evident anymore. So what color people have, that's their perspective of life, to have a happy life. Then, something about politics. It's too black and white. You have two kinds of politicians. First, the ones who are starting to be active in politics for developing the instruments to give to people to organize a happy life. And the other one, to have a lot of power. And if you want to have a lot of power, you have to collect a lot of votes. And today, in Western Europe, you can collect a lot of votes when you are very popular and when you are using the item migration. And why is it so popular? Because Martha Nussbaum, everyone knows her, I suppose, said that fear is the basic emotion of people. So if you are a politician who can play with the fear of people, you can become very popular. Yeah, and that's what's happening. So as a politician, it's quite difficult to say, but people, there are 50 shades of gray. They won't hear it. They don't want to hear it. Yeah, that's very difficult nowadays. I don't know for other countries, but I think in Belgium. So I was a little bit surprised about your very positive figures. I don't have this feeling. Yeah. What's also very important today, the context, because you are looking to individuals. I think the context is of economic crisis is very important, but also the graying and the whitening of society. Much more people older than 60 years, much more people older than 80 years. Whitening and verkaling, balding. Yeah. So it means that people are less flexible in thinking and more conservative when you are becoming older. It's not always like that, but mostly. And also fear. If you are becoming older, you lose every day something. So for that reason, receiving other people, that's not so easy in society. And then my last two remarks. I'm very in favor of the concepts of social capital and social infrastructure. Social capital is the quality of relations between people in a society, in a school, in an organization, also in the family, in the sports club. Yeah, what's the level of trust between people in a society, in a street, yeah, in a school? It's very important. If you don't have trust, you cannot change anything. It's a little bit like oil in an engine. You have the different parts, but you need the oil to make to work things together. That's trust. The big problem is with trust, you have to invest a lot of things, means to create trust. But it's very easy to break down trust very quickly. It's very easy to destroy it. And a second thing who is very important, if you know a little bit the Belgian communities, in former years, 50 years ago, on every corner of the street you had a cafe, a bar. And everyone went to the bar. And everyone knew each other, and they were discussing, and they were helping, and they were quarreling even, but there was interaction. Today, it's not the bar anymore. And the problem is we should think about how can we organize ourselves to create much more social infrastructure, to bring people together, to do things together. That can be a school, that can be nice streets, that can be parks, that can be infrastructure to organize together things, and so on. It's very, very important, and especially in big cities, but also in little villages. So, in fact, I'm looking for politicians who are taking their responsibility and who can explain to people, yes, we can. If we all work together, yeah, if we have a geographical distribution plan to integrate migrants, yeah, and especially asylum seekers, and if we all, with all our organizations and our energy, help people to integrate, it's good for them, it's good for us, yeah, it's good for society, it's good for economics, yeah, then we should do it, but we need politicians who are saying to our people, to all our people, don't be negative, look positive to the future. You can make the future, we can make it together, and it can be very different. I've tried to do it in Antwerp for 11 years. It was very severe and very clear, but I have done a lot of actions to integrate people in Antwerp, in our society, by education and by offering jobs. I think that's very, very important in the long term.
Thank you very much. So now we will open the floor to your questions. So just, I think, one microphone, maybe Vali or Andreas can help me to give to the audience. While you think about the questions, I would like to invite Tobias to join the panel. In this case, we will also address some concerns about the gender balance so far. So Tobias contributed a lot to the project that Esther presented. So everything related to perceptions and how to measure them using social media data can be addressed to Tobias. So we will have several rounds and we'll collect 3-4 questions. So let's proceed. And for the panelists, we would need to share the microphones. Just make sure you turn them on before speaking. Okay. Any questions so far? Yeah, we have 2.
Yes, I was just wondering, how can we reconcile your findings that attitudes towards migration are mostly on average getting positive with the fact that populist parties that have an anti-migration discourse are gaining influence in many European countries? So how can we reconcile the two?
Thank you. This goes especially to Esther and Tobias. My question is, with the loud minorities, you had a lot of descriptions, but moving beyond that and asking the why question, why do you think that minorities on the right seem to be louder than on the left, if that's the case? Is it more an issue of content, let's say certain types on the agenda, or using fear, or is it more a question of character? Are those on the right just more enthusiastic or know how to use social media better? Thank you.
And we have one more question from Sergio.
Thank you very much, Sergio Carrera, SEPS and EUI. Thank you for your excellent presentations. And my question relates to the comment presented by the discussant. Thank you also for your very insightful comments based on experience. And it comes back to emotions. You mentioned the relevance of emotions of people and how when you allow these interactions at the local level, somehow we come back to the values, more positive values as well, of humanity and be happy. No? And the question relates to that. Do public attitudes change at the local level when people, for instance, see the effects of implementing restrictive migration policies, so separating families, detaining minors, that they see the human effects of these policies? Does it change what people think about migration and kind of take it in a different place? It's not a migration issue anymore, it's a human issue. And I was wondering if at the local level even people mobilize some citizens against restrictive migration policies. I was wondering if there are any insights on this point. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have 3 questions. One about reconciling the evidence. The second about why minorities which are, let's say, more negative are also louder. And the third question is about the role of emotions and changing public attitudes. So I think we can just go step by step and let researchers comment on those things.
Okay, I'll take the first question, and maybe someone else contributes. Yes. So I think if you connect the first presentation by Esther and the second one on salience, that's really where an explanation can be. So this is an open an open research question on which many people throughout Europe are currently working. And one of the theories is that right now we're seeing the emergence of I'll leave that to Esther, sorry. We see polarization along something that is relevant to the second question. And one of the things you see is, for example, if you look at non-voters, who's turning out. There are people who haven't voted for quite a long time because they were waiting for change. You see this similar thing in the case of the US, with people who suddenly were drawn to cast their ballot in support of Donald Trump, because someone is offering a new opinion from the side of politicians. So previously, there was, for example, in Germany, no party which was really critical of the EU and of European policies, and then suddenly there was the alternative for Germany. So you have a part of the population which was always there, who now see that this issue is more important, it's more salient, because suddenly there are immigrants arriving in their neighborhoods, and then they are turning out to vote. So we don't know what the relative size of the different explanatory factors is, but an important factor is surely that people who were previously invisible at the ballot box are now turning out because there's someone offering something relevant to their opinion. And what the average is that Esther and I prepared for the policy report, or what OPAM shows on the website, always kind of hide, is that there are lots of people who say, well, you can't simplify it so much. Migration is neither good or bad. So I would actually not support what our policy discussant said, that half of the people are for and half of the people are against migration. Lots of people say, I'm rather neutral and I'd like to look at the facts, and it depends. And then there are people at both extremes. And these are the loud people to hand over to someone answering question 2.
Thanks a lot for the question. So if I got it right, the question was, why are they louder, or what is their capacity to actually get so very engaged? And I think when working on this social media data, we also really needed to find out who is actually commenting on social media. I really like to ask people in the audience if they have ever commented underneath a newspaper article on social media. Anybody? Yes. So I count 2. I don't know how many people are in the room, but that's very few people, right? And what we know from the research on people who are commenting on social media is that they usually share a couple of characteristics. Now you can see whether you find yourself in there. You go for coffee afterwards. So what we know about them, like on average, they are more skeptical on offline media. So they usually in German, you have this nice word, die Lügenpresse, so fake news, right? They are usually more skeptical of offline media, and they are politically quite engaged, or they have a strong political opinion, and that is not a characteristic that the average citizen necessarily shares. So this may be the case why many of those people are very active then also on social media. The people that we see there commenting, very often they only comment once, But there are a couple of people, especially, by the way, those who are commenting on European themes, they are commenting a lot more often. So if you want, this is a segment of the society that is more political than the rest of it and may thus be also more vocal. That may be one explanation. Another explanation is that it is, of course, very easy to comment also in an anonymized forum. It's not a normal discussion that you have where you know you are putting yourself out there, everybody can see who you are, and then you are debating. So it may also create some rooms just to be a little bit more rogue. We do see a lot of quite strong language on social media as well. So it's a way of debating that may also heat things up or portray a more fierce debate than would usually be the case if you were operating in an offline media environment. So this may determine a little bit why this debate is perceived to be so much louder than the large majority. But this is, I mean, we know a little bit about the profiles, but this is nothing that would be based on sound research that I could say, why are these people commenting? I don't know. I don't have the data on the individuals who are commenting in our data set, but this is the profiles that we know from research.
So we can pass the microphone if...
Yes, I would just like to answer a little bit the first question. Tobias already hinted at that a lot because, but it's not just about non-voters, it's actually also about voters. So how do we, why is there this discrepancy? People are actually becoming more positive, but we see this rise of populist parties. And I tried to talk about it a little bit in the presentation. It's just that people that have been anti-immigrant even in the past or have been all their life before chose different parties because they just did not think about immigration as a salient issue. They did not care about immigration because it wasn't just a topic for them. So they preferred to vote according to economic issues. For example, oh, will this party make, I don't know, social benefits higher and so on. Whereas now at this particular time, they see immigration as one of the most important topics that might affect their life, and therefore they cast the ballot for these parties.
Okay, I will react on two things. First, I don't know if it's existing in other countries, but we have a lot of trolls. Do you know that on social media? Yeah, you have political parties who engage people to react in a specific way, negative way, about migration on the social media. And it can be very hard in communication. For example, when every time I do an intervention in Parliament and it's on television, the next day I receive at least 20 very negative reactions. Even you should suicide yourself, yeah, in this way, yeah. So, and I can, as a politician, but maybe I'm too soft, I can assure you it hurts. Yeah, it's very difficult to cope with. Yeah. And then the second very difficult question, how can you change people, their minds, also on local level? Yeah. The Frankfurter Schule, because I'm a professor in ethics from university, and the Frankfurter Schule has done a lot of research on that, and that's quite difficult. At which moment people change minds? When their basic values are shocked. So a cultural shock can be an element. In fact, we should advise everyone in Belgium to travel all over the world. Yeah. And I have, when I was young, I've organized a lot of exchanges with young people, intercultural exchanges, and it's very effective. But you also see that when people come back, often they say Belgium is the best country of the world. Yeah. So for that reason, they don't tolerate migration or migrants. yeah, because it's a fear. Yeah. Then at local level, yeah, often migrants are, and especially asylum seekers from all over the world, are arriving in the neighborhoods who are quite poor. And in a way, we put all the poor people together in very difficult living conditions. Yeah, and I think that's not right. Yeah? And we give them very few instruments to integrate. It's easy if you are well educated, when you are rich, when you have common values, middle class or high class, all over the world. It's very easy to travel and to exchange and to communicate with people. But if you have a lot of poorness, no diplomas or no education, it's quite difficult to integrate. And then you see a lot of conflicts. Yeah, poor housing, a lot of children in small houses and apartments or flats. So difficult, not a lot of public room where you can organize things. A lot of people who don't understand the way of living and the procedures in the new society or the new house or environment. So positive people are trying to explain it, to work together, and they should be supported. If you don't do that, maybe they will change their minds, but in a negative way and not in a positive way. The most difficult question they can ask me as a politician in Belgium is, I'm now formulating the question, yeah. I have worked for 40 years, every day. I receive a pension of 1,200 euros, yeah. And a newcomer receives every month 1,000 euros. Yeah? Can you explain me why? I have worked for 40 years and my pension is 1,200 euros. They are coming in and we give them 1,000 euros a month. Yeah. It's quite difficult to react. In fact, I react always, your pension is too low. Yeah? But it's very difficult to explain. Maybe it's too simple, but if we not can look for solutions or for answers on that question in Europe, I think we will have no solution to the polarization, and I'm against the polarization, to be clear, in our society.
Perhaps just briefly on the last question, I think it's very important to remember that people who tend to be skeptical of immigration or even anti-immigration don't at least see themselves as intolerant or being against humanitarian projects, mainly because each and every one of us tries to keep up a positive image of themselves, right? We're all morally good people on one level or another, right? We just pick different levels, different dimensions. And I think what we need to look more at is the contradictions, the ambiguities, right? People don't know themselves that well. They don't reflect on a lot of things. And I think that's where narrative also comes in, to kind of look at these things and to kind of also see where perhaps different levels that Lenka talked about, the policy level, the different groups, immigration in general, and the effects of migration. These things tend to mix in the way that people talk about migration, perceive migration. So the policy level and how to address those different levels is one thing, but then on that level, we can be very clear and very, we can look for definitions. We can say, this is what we're going to do for that and that reason. But people don't work that way, right? We're all, we contradict ourselves. We're not that aware of what we actually think in some moments, right? We're very ambiguous towards a lot of issues. And these things need to be addressed more also than on the policy level to respond to that very human condition, right? That kind of plays a big role in migration.
Okay, thank you very much. So unfortunately, we are almost done with our time. So first of all, I would like to thank our presenters and discussant for coming and presenting and answering the questions. I would like to thank you for joining and also asking the questions. So basically, just to briefly sum up, I guess the today's policy dialogue maybe provoked even more questions. So first, for example, how do we reconcile research evidence and political perceptions? And if we say that attitudes are hard to change, we still saw that attitudes change. They either become more positive or for some people they become more negative. The open question is whether policymakers or let's say media should somehow say a different story or should try to accommodate the prevailing opinions. So I would say that there are many open questions which would probably require further work and further forum where we gather both researchers, policymakers, and also practitioners. And just to conclude, I would like to briefly advertise our next policy dialogue, which will also take place here at CEPS on the 3rd December. So it will not be about political and public perceptions, but it will be about EU and Africa migration. But again, we will have the forum where we will bring up researchers together with policymakers, both from Europe and also from Africa. So there we will discuss the role of aid and legal pathways to migration in preventing irregular migration. You're all welcome to come, and I'm pretty sure that this event, if you're not able to come, will be also live streamed and you could follow it online. Thank you very much. If you have any further questions, please contact the researchers. You can also see our outputs on the websites either of MEDAM or during the forum. Thank you.